Hello and welcome once again to Wrestling Histories here on both the WrestleTalk TV podcast network and on the WrestleTalk TV YouTube channel. And of course, if you're listening to us on WrestlePod.com, we thank you always for your support. I'm Alex Shane, and joining me for this very special podcast where we look at wrestling's glorious history and illustrious past is the man who is more qualified, in my opinion, than anyone else to do it in the United Kingdom. It's the author of the magnificent Wrestling Through the Power Slam magazines, the owner, creator and editor of Power Slam magazine himself. It's the one, the only Finlay Martin. Finn, how we doing?
Wonderful, Alex. It's been too long since our last Wrestling Histories episode.
Chapter is the word.
Chomping at the bit. I've been chomping at the bit for this next instalment.
Well, chapter 7, and they say 7 is lucky, allegedly, if you're into that kind of thing. And, of course, it can be lucky because we're talking about a man who many believe he was in the right place at the right time, if you call that luck, or seizing an opportunity. And that is the incredible rise of the Ultimate Warrior, a man who, in some ways, it's taken a good 20 years for insiders to actually credit him with being anything more than a fad or a form of mass hypnosis that suddenly grabbed hold of the wrestling audience and, most importantly, Vince McMahon. So that's something that we're going to talk about on this episode of Wrestling Histories. And we're also going to talk about his tag team partner in the Blade Runners tag team, a man who would be known in many ways as the worker of that tag team, the man known as Sting, and he's ascent to the top of the WWF rival Turner Broadcasting's WCW. So that's all coming up on this chapter of Wrestling Histories. But of course, we're going to have to talk about where we left off, Finn, because on the last episode, we spoke about the mega powers exploding as Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage had their epic confrontation at the Trump Plaza at WrestleMania 5. And we also discussed the ascent to power, not for a title, but to power and control of the creative process in WCW by the one and only Jim Herd. And I say one and only because he is considered one of the worst people to ever have an involvement in the creative process. Is there anything else Jim Herd-wise that I know one thing before we carry on that we didn't discuss on the last episode, and I know when we went off air, you were quite keen to discuss it, was the Dusty Rhodes Common Man sort of segments, and I don't know whether or not it's a good place to start before we get into the thick of the Ultimate Warrior.
Well, it can only improve from there, can it, Alex?
For sure.
So yeah, Dusty, I mean, as we've spoken about previously, he left WCW on bad terms. Then he went to work in Florida on an independent promotion with Mike Graham. Didn't work. They tried to do old style wrestling. So Dusty's like, hang on, this isn't working. What we're going to do? What's my next move? The next move was World Wrestling Federation. He arrived in May 1989. Obviously, Dusty had worked for Vince McMahon Sr., had a memorable sort of little run there with Superstar Graham of the Worldwide Wrestling Federation title back in 1977. Also, where Graham worked quite a few matches down in the Florida territory as well. Where Dusty was obviously based in the late 70s. So Dusty had been there before. He'd got over back in the late 70s. Obviously, it was a different crowd entirely by 1989. But they introduced him with these series of Common Man videos where he was working at a garage, he was working at a butcher's shop. Then he was even did a skit where he was working as a plumber. He always referred to himself as the son of a plumber. And yeah, the skits range from sort of mildly amusing to really sort of like toilet humor at its worst. It plumbs the depths, pardon the pun, in the plumber segment. I urge you not to watch that one on YouTube. It's out there if you want to subject yourself to it. Be warned, it's terrible. I mean, it's toilet humor at its worst, literally toilet humor at its worst. But the other segments there with Dusty working in a garage and working in the butcher's shop do have some merit. I think what Dusty should be applauded for in hindsight is that he came into enemy territory, WWF. He was given these segments, which were clearly designed to ridicule him. There's no doubt about that. But Dusty was it was as if he thought to himself, right, Vince, you've come up with this stuff to make me look as ridiculous as possible, but I'm going to make it work because I'm that charismatic. And in his own way, Dusty does make the segments work. They are, it's down market stuff, it's low rent stuff, but Dusty is, he does have that charm, and I think he sort of gets away with it, at least in the garage and the butcher's shop segments. But there was no saving the plumbing segment. There was no saving that at all. But Dusty came in there, and I think he got over well in those segments. And he came in, and his first feud was with the Big Boss Man, which I think was, pretty. I think a lot of people remember that as a good mid-card program.
I'm very interested in how much of that gimmick was based around humiliating Dusty, because obviously the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase had his manservant who was called Virgil, and most people will know that Virgil is the real name of Dusty Rhodes. So do you believe that Virgil was really done on purpose? And why, did Vince really have a personal gripe against Dusty Rhodes in particular above anyone else that he could have, he didn't name, I don't know, like Hulk Hogan's dog Crockett, or, it just seems really interesting that like Dusty Rhodes was almost picked out of a Jim Crockett lineup to be the foe.
Well, I mean, Dusty was the booker, wasn't he? He was Crockett's booker. And you've got to remember that war was nasty. So, there's no doubt about it. I mean, it is notable that the guy who played Virgil, Mike Jones, when he went over to work for WCW in the mid-90s, he was then called Vince. So it's, his entire career, he was named after opposing bookers, the opposing promotion's booker. So that's quite a claim to fame, really, isn't it, Alex?
Well, maybe he should get a sex change and be called Dixie and have a comeback. It could happen.
I'm not going to say anything about that, but there's no doubt at all that Ted DiBiase's manservant Virgil, that was a pop at Dusty for sure. That war was nasty. We've talked about how horrible it was, and I think unless you were really following it at the time, it would be hard for you to, because so much time has passed. So memories have faded, but things weren't pleasant. There was a lot at stake then, a lot of money at stake, a lot of jobs at stake. And those two sides didn't like each other. But of course, when Dusty needed a job and Vince knew he'd be able to make some money with Dusty, then all sins were forgiven. And once Dusty was a member of Team Vince and he, paid his penance by appearing in these little videos, then Dusty was there, and of course wearing polka dots. Dusty was embraced as a member of the WWF family.
And I've just thought about this. If Virgil was to end up getting a sex change, from what you hear on the internet, it would be a very long operation. All right, well, it had to be said. Sorry, it was just there. Talking of toilet humour, I tried to stay in the theme of how we began. Now let's move into something that's a little bit more. This is going to be an interesting one, because the Ultimate Warrior is such. Even the way he died, there's so much speculation and bizarre thought that goes around the Warrior. Like, there's a conspiracy theory that the Warrior that returned at WrestleMania 8 wasn't the real one. I've heard people at school say that, and then Ben Spindler on Wrestle Talk brought that up as still a belief that obviously it was the real Jim Hellweek, but lots of people had that belief. He went through this bizarre period, obviously, when he was sort of saying a lot of very homophobic rhetoric during his sort of foray into politics, and then his death after the destruction of the Ultimate Warrior, where everything was forgiven and then he was loved again. The Warrior is possibly one of the single most divisive characters that has probably been alive in my lifetime as a pro wrestler. And what we're going to talk about for the first half of Chapter 7 is really the ascent to the top of the WWF for this guy who, in many ways, epitomised fans' opinion of wrestling in the late 80s, early 90s. You talk about, Savage and Hogan, but the Ultimate Warrior was right up there, and he would very quickly disappear, which obviously we'll do on another chapter. But here's the question I have, Finn, and I'm dying to know your opinion on this, okay? The Ultimate Warrior was the first person that Vince McMahon really trusted at the top of the card who wasn't an experienced worker, someone who had a track record of being able to, call a match on the fly, go the distance. Previously in that main event spot, you had Hulk Hogan, who, despite anything you can say about Hulk Hogan, the guy knew what he was doing. He was very good at his act. He was an expert at that act. Ted DiBiase, Randy Savage, these Paul Orndorff, Roddy Piper, all of these people were really skilled wrestlers. And then you get the Ultimate Warrior. And my question for you is, do you think the Ultimate Warrior was a reflection of Vince's ego, almost being, now we are so sports entertainment that I can make someone who's not even a wrestler become the main figurehead of this company?
Yeah, I think it was just, I think time had moved on, and all those people you'd mentioned had all gotten older, and Vince had already done all the programs really he could with them. So it was like time for him to try something else. But he'd had that success earlier in the year, and in fact, in that year with Zeus, he managed to actually do that huge buy rate at SummerSlam '89 with him as 1/4 of the main event. And Warrior, he'd only had like was it 85 he got into wrestling, so he'd only had like 4 years experience by that point. So, it was somebody that could be carried. I think most would agree that Warrior's matches with Rick Rude at WrestleMania 5 and SummerSlam '89 were respectable. Were, by the standards of the time, they were pretty good. You can put that down to Rude. Of course, Rude does deserve the lion's share of the credit for the quality of those matches. If you put Warrior in there with somebody who really wasn't very good, Andre the Giant being a classic example, Warrior and Giant and Andre had some really dreadful matches, and Warrior had some awful matches with all sorts of people. But if he was in there with the right guy, he could be carried. And a huge part of his appeal was not so much the match quality, it was the entrance, him running around and doing everything else. So I think you've got to look at the Warrior, and you can't really compare him to other people and say, well, yeah, he couldn't do this and he couldn't do that and he couldn't do the other. What he could do is his act. His act was completely different to everything which had preceded it. Vince thought that this was his guy. This was the replacement for Hogan. Hogan was, Hogan, he wasn't ready to retire. Obviously, he carried on wrestling for many more years. But I think Hogan was sort of, how much longer was he going to be able to go full time? How much longer did he want to go full time? Did he want to do movies? Did he want to do TV? There was all sorts of things Hogan wanted to do. So Warrior was a guy that Vince believed would be with him for the long haul, which of course wasn't the case. But at the time, Vince felt that would happen, that Warrior was a guy that he could bank on for years to come. So I think he saw Warrior as a guy who brought something completely different to the table. And when it came to big matches that needed to deliver, then they'd put Warrior in there with a Rick Rude, a Kurt Hennig, Mr. Perfect, a Randy Savage, or somebody who could offset Warrior's shortcomings. I think that was Vince's plan. He would put him in there with people who would counterbalance, who would fill in the blanks, do the things that Warrior couldn't do, because people were paying to see Warrior shake the ropes, run around, do those insane interviews, and all those other things he did. That was Warrior's appeal. It wasn't being a top worker.
The Survivor Series 1989 is not one that you would look at really as a wrestling fan and see that as a massive milestone. For example, the following year's SummerSlam, it would be the debut of The Undertaker, and many people always remember that for that exact reason. But Survivor Series 1989 had one real standout occurrence that took place on it. And from as far as I'm aware, that was the event where Vince McMahon really took a gamble and decided to see if the Warrior could headline a main event and a pay-per-view outside of Hogan, who had been the go-to guy for his main events all this time. Tell us a little bit about Survivor Series 89, and did the gamble pay off in Vince's eyes?
I'm not sure if it did pay off in Vince's eyes. I don't think it really paid off in many people's eyes. The main event was Warrior, Jim Neidhart, and the Rockers versus Bobby Heenan, Arn Anderson, Haku, and Andre the Giant. Now, Bobby Heenan, we'll talk in a moment why Bobby Heenan was in the match. Should have been Tully Blanchard, but Bobby Heenan had to step in. We'll get to that in a moment. That match went on last. Hogan's match went on in the middle of the card. He was pitted against Zeus in a Survivor Series elimination match. Let's just say these were Survivor Series elimination matches. So yeah, Hogan was there in the middle of the card. Warrior went on last. Warrior won. He last eliminated Bobby Heenan. Didn't really think it was much of a match. I thought the stuff with Warrior and Heenan was just absurd. They had done, and I'm sure you remember these, Alex.
The weasel suit matches.
Exactly. They did these strange weasel suit matches, which Heenan would carry. And it was all based around Heenan having like what actually looked like a lolly stick. Maybe it was a WWF ice cream bar lolly stick, which he was using. He kept using to jab in Warrior's throat, and Warrior would sell it. And then they do all these comedy spots with Heenan, running away from Warrior and then breaking the rules. And then in the end, Warrior would, of course, win and shoved Heenan into the weasel suit. So, I mean, they were sort of these bizarre comedy matches that Heenan really should have been having with like a mid-card and not with Warrior. So, I never really understood the appeal of those. And this main event with Warrior, last man standing, and finally eliminated Heenan, I don't think it was a success as a match. It was, I remember at the time watching it and being quite disappointed by it. But the idea was, let's see how Warrior does on top. He's going to be our guy in 1990. Let's test him out in the main event at Survivor Series. And yeah, the outcome was, I just thought it was just a bit of a strange match and not really a pay-per-view caliber main event match.
Now, it's really unfortunate because if I make a list of my favourite tag team rivalries and confrontations of all time, one of them, which is quite a surprise, will be on the next chapter of Wrestling Histories. And it was a WCW rivalry. But one of the other ones that I consider, in terms of the quality of the matches and how they still stand the test of time and are very groundbreaking in terms of the stuff that the guys are doing in the ring, the chemistry, is the Rockers against the Brainbusters. I mean, particularly the best of 3 Falls Saturday Night's main event match that they had still, to me, holds up as a fantastic match. Had Tully Blanchard have been in this match, you would have had the Brainbusters and the Rockers really there to carry the bulk of that match, and it may have been remembered as being a lot more entertaining because when you look at it now, you've got Bobby Heenan, Haku, and Andre the Giant. None of those guys on paper are going to give you really a great match. I mean, Bobby Heenan, if you go back and you watch those matches, he was taking a hell of a bump, for a manager, essentially. But Arn Anderson is not going to be able to carry that match on his own. What happened with Tully Blanchard? Why was he not at Survivor Series 1989?
Yeah, as we were just saying there about Warrior. Warrior needed a guy on the other side of the ring who could really make it work for him. And Heenan, it was more of a sort of comedy act that he portrayed. I mean, he was a manager after all, so that's why it really didn't work. And as you say, Andre he retired basically from WWF the next year. Haku was a solid guy, but not really charismatic and not really a main event guy, which left it down to Arn Anderson. So that's why we had the match we did. Now, as for Tully Blanchard, yes, this is a very, very famous inside story at the time. I'm sure most of you already know it. What happened was Tully Blanchard was suspended on November 2nd. That's 21 days before the Survivor Series, which took place November 23rd, 1989. Blanchard was suspended on November 2nd for testing positive for cocaine. This was the only drug the WWF tested for at the time. Now, it was snowing in the WWF by all accounts. I've read that there was a lot of cocaine use in the Florida territory, actually way back in the first half of the 1970s. But cocaine apparently did not become a major problem in the WWF until the 1980s. Cocaine had swept through the music and movie industries in the 1970s, but it wasn't until the 1980s that it really put a chokehold on the wrestling business. Obviously, World Class, something we'll get to later, the World Class in North Texas, that had a terrible drug reputation, all sorts of casualties there due to drugs. So it was a drug that Vince felt that it was prudent for him to test for, and Tully he was caught, he was nailed, and he was suspended. This was a devastating suspension for Blanchard. He'd already given notice to the WWF and had agreed a 3-year contract with WCW worth $250,000 per year. Survivor Series was to be his last night in the WWF. Though WCW did not have a drug testing policy, it actually withdrew its contract offer to Blanchard due to his drug test failure in the WWF. Also, WCW reduced its financial offer to Arn Anderson, who was supposed to come in with Blanchard as a tag team to reform the Horsemen with Ric Flair. And, a bit of a despicable stunt there. I mean, I can understand why WCW withdrew its contract offer to Blanchard, but I think that's, to me, that was not on at all, reducing Arn's contract offer. Basically, I feel that WCW did it because it could get away with it. I can't think of another good reason for them doing that. Can you, Alex?
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because as a man who is known to throw around the occasional conspiracy theory, here's one for you. The JFK assassination. No, I'm only joking. No, Jim Herd. It's quite well known that Jim Herd and Ric Flair were not getting along. At least in the early. I don't know at this point, but definitely in like 91 and late 90, where it was kind of he wanted Ric Flair to be Spartacus and shave his hair and this kind of thing. And obviously, I'm just curious to know whether or not the reforming of the Horsemen. Now, my timeline could be a bit off on this, but I wonder if there is more to the idea of not giving the Horsemen that level of power again. Because to me, and the only reason I'm saying that is because what a loss to not have Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson as a tag team. I mean, they were in many. It's hard to say they were in their prime, but I can't, even though you can find more bloody and more sort of gripping showdowns, I guess, in earlier years in the NWA, I don't think that they had lost a step as a tag team in 89. In fact, my favourite matches with Arn and Tully are from 1989. So it just seems, I can't understand it. It makes no sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Ric Flair was on the booking team at that point. So it was actually Ric Flair who had to ring Tully, his longtime pal. And it was Flair who'd actually arranged for Arn and Tully to come back because, Arn and Tully had left Crockett in 88 because they weren't happy. They just felt like they were being underpaid. They weren't happy with the way the situation was going there with Dusty and everything else. Ric Flair's got part of the booking committee in late 89, and it was Flair who actually arranged for Anderson and Blanchard to join the company and got them those nice juicy contracts as well. And then it was Flair who actually had to ring Blanchard and give him the bad news that WCW had pulled its contract offer. And that was it. I mean, that was basically the end of Blanchard's wrestling career. He did do indie stuff, but that was it, the end of his big-time wrestling career anyway. One point I should make, and I wrote this in Pro Wrestling Through the Power Slam years, WCW did not withdraw its contract offer to Scott Hall after he failed a drug test in the WWF in 1996, after he'd given his notice. So I know that was a different era entirely. It's more than 6 years later, but there was definitely, Blanchard, his contract was pulled. Scott Hall, you failed a drug test. Well, that's all right. You're still welcome. So there was definitely some. Bischoff, I guess, was running the show then, and things were different.
Well, it sounds like a convenient time also for WWE or WWF to run a drug test on Scott Hall.
Yes.
If there's already a precedent that somebody who was going to leave and join the opposition got his offer revoked because he failed a drug test on the way out, what a time to do it to Scott Hall. And can you imagine if WCW had repeated history, how different wrestling history would be? But I guess that's why we are here to tell you about what actually happened. Now, I guess moving forward,
that's an excellent point there. I mean, if WCW had pulled its contract offer to Scott Hall, would there have been a New World Order?
It's an interesting one. That'll be for our next series, Alternate Wrestling Histories. So now let's stick to what really happened, because I want to know, importantly, SummerSlam 89. How was that received, both sort of from a creative perspective, but also from a gate and a pay-per-view perspective as well?
Do you mean Survivor Series?
Sorry,
89?
Survivor Series 89. I've got my SS's confused.
Yeah, it was did about 380,000 buys, so that was down from SummerSlam, which had done 575,000. So I think that was seen as, I don't know whether that was seen as a disappointment because we had Hogan Zeus again. So I mean that had already been done, and then we had the Warrior versus the Heenan family, which was hardly like was hardly going to do any huge business. So I think the numbers were seen as sort of acceptable. I think it would have been unrealistic to expect the show to have done any better than it did.
Okay, well, I mean, despite that, and maybe it not reaching the heights that Vince had hoped for, it didn't stop him pulling the trigger on the rise of the Ultimate Warrior and his eventual showdown with Hulk Hogan, which would begin really in epic fashion, or it would really not begin, but it would really reach the first time we got a chance to really see where that was going was at the first big show of 1990 for the WWF, which is, of course, the Royal Rumble. And I remember, because this was a period of time when I first became a wrestling fan, I'd watched the British wrestling stuff on television, but this was when I first started getting the first show that I actually looked forward to seeing, and as I'm a wrestling fan now, was WrestleMania 6. But the weeks before that, somebody lent me Survivor Series 89 and the Royal Rumble 1990. So this period is, the magic of Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior double shoulder blocking, and you hearing, again, nobody moves. I've really got like fond memories of that. Let's talk a little bit about the Royal Rumble, and also politically, I'm fascinated to know if there's any stories about how Hogan responded to Vince's shift in direction.
Well, Hogan wasn't happy about it. I mean, I think even though he'd planned to, he did he'd done like No Holds Barred, then he did Suburban Commando, he did other movies, and that was going to be his focus. I think he felt like he could cross over because he was huge at the time, and this was obviously pre-steroid scandal, so he hadn't been tainted by that yet. So, I mean, I think Hogan, I think his idea, I don't think he wanted to be there full time anymore. I think he got to a point where he's just like, well, I'll do some stuff for you, but I don't want to be full time anymore. But at the same time, it was like Hogan's ego was huge. Did he want to put Warrior over? If you put Warrior over, would Warrior get over, and would Hogan lose his power, lose his money making ability with Vince McMahon's company? So I think Hogan was torn in that he wanted to look after himself, but it was like, well, this is the guy that's going to take over, and maybe, I think Hogan was in a predicament there. He didn't really know what to do. I don't think he was really keen on putting Warrior over, but at the same time, because he feared that he might become bigger than him. But at the same time, I think Hogan he'd reached the end of the line as a full-time performer, and he wanted to do other things. So it's like, I think it's sort of difficult to look at it now, because modern wrestlers generally do put people over when they leave. But back then, wrestlers were, especially a wrestler of Hogan's standing, when it came to doing jobs, this was something that he was very, very selective about. I mean, you've got to remember, before Hogan faced Warrior at WrestleMania 6, he hadn't done a clean job since he returned to the company. So, I mean, that's like return to the company December 83, and here we are. His next clean job is April 1, 1990. I mean, that's amazing when you think about it, Alex, isn't it? Absolutely incredible.
Yeah, it is incredible. I didn't realise that they're uncredible. I didn't realise that it. Wow, yeah, that is
an actual proper clean. Obviously he'd lost the belt to Andre, but we covered that with the twin referee finish. And there were like count-out losses, famously to the Genius on Saturday night's main event. I'm sure you remember that one, Alex.
With the broken belt scenario, is that around isn't that around the same time that Perfect and Genius took Hogan's belt and smashed it with a hammer?
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, well, they'd had that feud because Mr. Perfect was Hogan's lead rival, actually, in the Royal Rumble match, which I'm going to mention in a second. So Perfect was Hogan's number one nemesis at that time. He was his rival, and Genius was attached to Perfect. So they'd had tag matches together, and then Genius had that match with Hogan on Saturday night's main event, which Genius won by count out, if memory serves me correctly.
And can I just mention that the Genius rocked out a moonsault as well? If you go back and watch it, many people don't remember this, but the Genius actually did a moonsault. I swear. Yeah, he did.
You're right.
Yeah.
He did. And this was before the great Muta, Keiji Muta, arrived in WCW.
Wow.
So an innovator. Lanny Poffo, innovator. Deserves more credit. That's what I say.
And a great poet as well. Now the Royal Rumble, I mean, I obviously have memories of this being more epic because it's my sort of 10 or 11-year-old child self that remembers it. But what was the kind of the talk of the industry around this period when it became apparent that Hogan and the Warrior were going to come head to head? And talk us through how it all came about.
Yeah, I mean, this was something that they'd been working towards for a while. And Warrior had been, ever since he'd regained the Intercontinental title from Rick Rude at SummerSlam 1989, this was Vince's plan, was Hogan versus Warrior at WrestleMania 6. So, I mean, it was a bit, the first time ever that two babyfaces clashed in the main event of the show. So it was seen as, quite novel at the time. Warrior was seen by most people, as the guy who was going to take over from Hogan. As I've already said, Vince saw Warrior as this guy who was going to be his man for the next few years. Hogan had probably become a part-time attraction at that point. That was the plan, but Warrior was going to be the guy leading the charge. He was going to be the one carrying the flag for the World Wrestling Federation. So yeah, I think people were quite excited to see how it would play out, who would win, because it seemed, because Hogan had never lost, the idea of Hogan losing to Warrior at WrestleMania 6 was sort of unthinkable. But most people realized that Warrior had to go over because he was the younger guy who was on the ascent, and Hogan was the veteran who was going to be going part-time. He was going to be doing a movie over the summer. So it was definitely had to be Warrior who was going over. So they had their first meeting, their first clash in the Royal Rumble match, which was January 21st, 1990. The ring sort of cleared, and suddenly Warrior, Hogan there, facing off against each other. Do you remember that moment, Alex?
I do. It was the Hogan Rock face-off, but like 15 years before Hogan Rock.
I mean, I remember it, and it was so exciting. And you think back to yourself, think back and think, well, was it really that exciting? And yes, it was that exciting, seeing those two square off. And then they were like doing the power moves. And actually, if you watch it now, you can see that Hogan was, when he was running into him, Warrior nearly fell down at one point. And Warrior was supposed to just no sell it, but Hogan smashed into him so hard that Warrior nearly went over, which I thought was pretty funny. Sure, it was an accident, and then Hogan accidentally eliminated Warrior when Warrior's battling other people near the ropes. So then Hogan went on, and he won the Rumble by last eliminating Mr. Perfect. So they had the confrontation. Warrior was then sort of eliminated by Hogan, but did Hogan do it deliberately? Anyway, that was the setup there for WrestleMania 6. But going into the match, the big story was Hogan versus Perfect, which really wasn't that well received by the public, as evidenced by the buy rate of the Royal Rumble, which actually only did 260,000 buys, which was seen as a huge flop. And I think even though he's no longer with us, I think Perfect does, or whoever you want to blame, it was Perfect who was not seen as a strong challenger. Whether that was down to Perfect or down to WWF not presenting him as a strong challenger, well, you decide that. But Perfect was not seen as this threat to Hogan, and Hogan did throw him over the top rope very easily, as I recall. So, I mean, Perfect to me was never really a sort of super strong challenger to Hogan. I never saw him as a threat to Hogan ever.
Yeah, I mean, we were still in the era of the big heavyweight guys, and I think Randy Savage just had an aura that transcended his size, whereas Perfect, to me at least, was a great mid-card hand. And I do mean a great mid-card. I mean, I don't mean that in a sort of like, a detrimental way, but you can find matches that Hennig had against Tito Santana, like, when he was defending the IC belt, that are like blow-away matches, and you think, God, I can't remember the last time I saw Tito Santana in a blow-away match. But Perfect was absolutely phenomenal, and but I all think one of his best attributes was also to his detriment in a match with Hogan, and that was his bumping ability, because he flew around that ring so much that, in a way, it was never going to be the irresistible force meeting the immovable object. It was going to be the irresistible force meeting the springy, bouncy, flipping upside down from every bit of offense object. And I think that kind of hurt him in the eyes of the fans.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that, a lot of people compare Dolph Ziggler to Mr. Perfect, and I think that is a valid comparison. And when you look at Dolph Ziggler, I mean, Dolph's a guy that's never really become that top guy, and I don't think he ever will, because he doesn't wrestle like a top guy. He just doesn't. And obviously WWE now isn't treating him as a top guy. But you go back to Perfect, and yeah, he just didn't really have that menacing aura. But as you say, he was a hell of a mid-card talent. Everyone remembers his match with Bret Hart from SummerSlam 91. I mean, that was a match that, that was just the perfect, pardon the pun, the perfect match.
Fantastic! I loved it. It was a damn good pun. Did I once tell you that I entered the National Pun Writing Championships?
No, but I can feel that there's another pun coming.
There was a £50,000 cash prize, so I thought, well, at this point in time, that would be a great thing to win. So instead of just sending one pun, I thought I'm going to send 10, and I was really hoping I'd get the cash, but unfortunately, no pun intended. No pun. Come on. Come on. All right. Okay. So back to the. I do apologise to our listeners who tune into this just for the serious wrestling historical chat. It has gone somewhat off the wagon on this one, so let's bring it back on course. And before we get to WrestleMania 6, I got to ask you: is there anything else on the Royal Rumble 1990 card that's of note and worth mentioning?
Not really. I mean, on the undercard, there was 2 disqualification finishes on the 4-match undercard. Can you imagine WWE pulling that now? People would be storming out of the building. So I think probably the best match on the undercard was Ron Garvin's bout with Greg Valentine. That was probably the only thing on the undercard that I would recommend you watch. But I mean, overall, Royal Rumble was, apart from the Hogan Warrior square off, I mean, that was the highlight of the Royal Rumble. Apart from that, there really wasn't much on that show that you would want to watch again.
Unlike the following year, when one of the undercard matches, I'm sure we'll cover it, but probably gloss over it, but the Rockers against the Orient Express, they did it 2 Royal Rumbles in a row, and they're really, really good undercard matches, but that's for another chapter of wrestling history. All right, well, should we get to the big one? Should we get to the Sky Dome, a venue that Hogan has made famous in more ways than... He made it famous for a match with the Warrior, famous for a match with The Rock, and famous for saying it incorrectly in a massive angle with Austin and The Rock. WrestleMania 6, I mean, it was a huge show. It was my first WrestleMania. Before we get to... I guess let's go straight into the main event, and we can sort of go back through the undercard. Was there... I mean, that's a big building to fill, and we're a long way from WrestleMania 3. Was there any concern, do you think, going into this, that, like, if Warrior had already not been a massive success, main event in Survivor Series 89, that Warrior v Hogan may not draw?
I think by that point, WrestleMania was becoming the draw. I think that was a big part of it. Toronto was always a terrific city for Hogan. We know that because... as we previously discussed, the famous Hogan versus Paul Orndorff match that took place there. So that was Toronto, wasn't it? I'm sure it was Toronto.
It was, yeah.
Toronto. So, I mean, that was always one of Hogan's, best cities was Toronto, always a big WWF town. So I think the appeal of WrestleMania, coupled with the first ever Hogan Warrior matchup, I think they were pretty confident about selling it out, and sell it out they did. To the tune of 64,287 fans, paying a live gate a new record of $3.49 million. big money. So yeah, it was a huge success. I think as a live event, it drew 550,000 buys. Now I think they were expecting more because Savage versus Hogan had done more than that, and the pay-per-view universe kept expanding, so more homes had been equipped with pay-per-view. So the theory was that more and more people would continue to buy the events because there was more availability. So this was actually a decline from WrestleMania 5, which I think a lot of people put down to the babyface versus babyface dynamic. Even though it was the first ever meeting between Hogan and Warrior, it was still face versus face, so they didn't have that huge sort of emotion. There wasn't that sort of vengeance, like that. Obviously, Hogan was going for vengeance against Savage at WrestleMania 5. There wasn't any of that at WrestleMania 6. So I think a lot of people put the slightly disappointing buy figure down to there being no animosity between the two. I think that was seen as the reason why it didn't do better than it did. But I mean, overall, as an event financially, it was another hit for the company. I mean, that cannot be denied.
Well, it's tough as well, isn't it? Because I always believe that wrestling fans like to, whether they realise it or not, and wrestling promoters do it as well, but they like to live vicariously through their chosen favourite. And when you're watching a match with your chosen favourite against a heel, you know that there's a good chance that you're going to see, particularly at WrestleMania, where very rarely does the heel win. You know you're going to see the payoff, and your favourite is going to win. But in this situation, you're paying to see one of your favourites potentially lose because you may like both Hogan and Rock. So, you're going to be disappointed at the same time as you're going to be elated as well, which is a weird... so the actual spectacle, I don't know if wrestling had reached that point where the spectacle of two guys that are, like now, in a parallel setting, I guess if you had John Cena against Roman Reigns, that would be interesting because people would be like, okay, who's Vince going to go for? But at that point in time, it was like you hadn't been programmed to care about who the company was getting behind. So it was kind of one of your favourites was definitely going to lose. And I think that probably did affect the buy rate, but not the live gate, because WrestleMania, hey, like you said, it's WrestleMania. It started to really become a big deal. I'm going to put something out there, and this is, Pro Wrestling Illustrated. This was the 1990 Pro Wrestling Illustrated Match of the Year. Interestingly, 1990's Pro Wrestling Illustrated Match of the Year was Hogan v Warrior. 91 was Sting and Lex Luger against the Steiner Brothers. And 92 was Bret Hart against the British Bulldog at SummerSlam. So 3 years in a row, babyface matches won the Match of the Year. And a lot of people sort of go, oh, well, it can't have been a very good year for matches. But you got to give those guys credit, man, because I thought they did. It's one of the most epic stadium matches of all time.
Oh yeah, Hogan versus Warrior. Absolutely, it was. I mean, lots of people look back on it and say, well, it wasn't very good. Because, a lot of people don't like Hogan and Warrior and are always looking for ways of, nitpicking. And you might think, well, Finley, you're a hypocrite 'cause you used to do that with John Cena. I'm not going to discuss that right now. But Hogan and Warrior, these were two guys who, who were generally relying on their opponent to do the work. So on the night, it was up to those two guys to make the match work. And they were out there for a long time. It was like, what was it, 22 minutes and 51 seconds the match lasted. So that was a long match. They didn't really do that much in it. If you go back and look at it, it was lots of tests of strength. And
the world's longest bear hug.
Yeah, exactly. Lots of rest holds and things like that. And, it was, but what did you really expect? It wasn't going to deliver, it wasn't going to deliver anything too technical and anything too spectacular. That wasn't what Hogan and Warrior did. And anyone who went into it expecting that should have just watched something else. There would have been other matches out there that could have provided them with what they wanted. This was all about the emotion, and, these two titans of the ring clashing and who would win. And really, it was all about the finish. It was all about the outcome. And I've got to say, they got the finish absolutely spot on. It was absolutely brilliantly executed, I thought. Hogan smashed Warrior with the big boot. Then he went for the leg drop, but Warrior rolled out of the way. Warrior he capitalized and then hit Hogan with the big splash and got the convincing 1, 2, 3. Hogan stayed down. There was none of that shoulder up on 3 business, which we used to see with people who didn't like doing jobs such as Road Warrior Hawk and people like that. So Hogan, to his credit, did stay down for the 3. Absolutely, definitely, no doubt about that. So I mean, I thought the finish was well done. And then what happened next? Hogan stole Warrior's thunder. But I mean, up until that moment, I thought it was very well done. And Warrior was put over, and he came out of there as the double champ.
Now, a lot of people say that Warrior had his thunder stolen by Hogan because for those that don't remember, Hogan, it reminds me of actually something that you once wrote in Power Slam, and I totally agreed that when Shawn Michaels was stripped of the IC title because he got beat up by allegedly 9 Thugs in Syracuse. That's a whole nother chapter of wrestling histories. But, his face was all beat up and Dean Douglas pulled the belt away from him and he stood there with his hands outstretched. And Shawn Michaels walked up the entranceway and did one last look at the ring. And you basically said he stole the show with that look. And I'll tell you what, including Sheamus, right, I've given this spot. I did a spot where I tell the guy they've got 10 seconds to leave and blah, 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 blah. But it's a whole like thing where I say, with Sheamus in Ireland, I said, there's a contract waiting for you in the back. I'm going to take you to England to become a big star, but you've got 10 seconds to get out of my ring. And I said, look, I want you to walk away. And as you're about to leave, I want you to stop and turn back and look at the ring and give that look where Shawn Michaels had the belt taken away from him. And Sheamus was one of the guys that actually knew the look I was talking about and did it fantastically. And it was so, that look of this is my last opportunity and it's going, right? And Hogan is, as much as I always say that's the Shawn Michaels getting the IC title stripped look, it really is the Hogan realising that he's been beat by Warrior look. Because what happens is Hogan leaves the ring, he looks back, he takes the belt, he looks at it like, oh my God, I can't believe this is not mine anymore. And then he hands it to the Warrior. And he would argue it was a passing of the torch, but it actually made the moment about, oh my God, I don't want to see Hogan go. Like, I really like Hogan. Do you think that he had, because he always says that he thought Warrior wasn't the guy, so he did that on purpose to scoop the heat. Do you think there's that much thought went into it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Hogan in his first autobiography, Hollywood Hulk Hogan even, he wrote about this and, shamelessly admitted that he stole Warrior's thunder deliberately. I mean, it was his intention all along to do that. So, yeah, I think so. And there was no other reason for him to do that, other than let's get the attention on me. It's all about me. Okay, Warrior's scored the pin, but I'm going to take this as a leave, just like he did with The Rock at WrestleMania 2002. He did exactly the same thing. Rock won that match, but no one even remembered the outcome of the match because it was all about Hogan. It was his match. So, yeah, there's no doubt in my mind that that was his intention. Warrior got played. And that's the way it works. That's the way it works in Hogan's world. And I always think, that Steve Austin, and particularly Bret Hart, we'll get to this in 93, there was, some debate as to whether or not Hogan was going to lose the WWF title to Bret Hart in 1993 in a babyface versus babyface match. Now, if that match had happened, Hogan would have done exactly the same thing to Bret Hart. So Bret Hart should thank his lucky stars that he didn't win the title from Hulk Hogan, because Hogan, he would have just played him like a Stradivarius, just like he did with Warrior and just like he did with Rock in 2002.
And that's why Austin didn't want to work Hogan, as you alluded to, because he thought the same thing.
I believe so, yeah. I mean, there were probably other reasons, but I think Austin knew that Hogan was the master, and there was no one better than Hogan ever in wrestling history at working the crowd. No one even close to as good as Hulk Hogan ever. So I don't think Austin would have wanted to put himself in the ring with Hogan at that point, because I think Austin knew that Hogan would have done something to get one over on him. And I'm sure Hogan would have done it, because that's what he did. He had form for it. We've seen him do it before. And that was how he became such a big star, by doing that.
Now, one of our other bits of awesome content, well, I say awesome, it's a bit biased, but it's two, you may have heard of Two Girls, One Cup. Well, on the Wrestle Talk TV YouTube channel, we have Two Blokes, One Match, where myself and Ollie Davis, it's a bit goggle box, and we dissect a match, a famous match. And we just recently did Hogan and Rock, actually, on my request. But the one before that, it was, who was it? AJ Styles against Sami Zayn. So it's quite varied. And I was talking about the difference where people talk about wrestling psychology and the difference in how a lot of smart fans think wrestling psychology is I start working on the arm and I finish working on the arm, and that's psychology, but that's match psychology. What to me wrestling psychology is, and when someone's a great wrestling psychologist, it's not I started on the arm, I finished on the arm. It's being a master of human psychology, and that allows you to understand the psychology of an audience. They were fantastic. In fact, this is going a little bit academic now, but Gustave Le Bon is like a genius on his books. I mean, these are over 100 years old, almost 100 years old, these books. But he wrote books like The Crowd and Edward Bernays, Manufacturing Consent. And there's so many books about how when you get a crowd together, the psychology of a crowd takes on a life of its own, and it's different to that of the psychology of an individual. And Hogan was the greatest mass psychologist in wrestling. Like, he understood that, and he is in a level all on his own when it comes to working. The bigger the crowd, the more he's in his element. And so when you think about great psychologists, that's what Hogan was. He was the greatest, I think, wrestling psychologist of all time. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't effective, but I mean, sorry, it wasn't pretty and it wasn't intricate, but it was certainly effective. So that's my sort of 2 cents on that. Now, before we move on to, we're going to do a little bit about Sting in WCW, but I'm aware that time is running away. What else was there that was on the WrestleMania 6 card that stood out to you? Because it was I think I may be right in saying this, but I remember when I was a kid, I'm pretty sure I counted, and there was 14 matches on WrestleMania 6. I don't know if that's accurate or if I dreamt it, but it seemed like there was a hell of a lot of matches on that show.
14 matches, absolutely right, Alex. Yeah, I mean, it was once again a totally overloaded show. There weren't really, on the undercard, none of the matches were really that good, and there was a few interesting results. Mr. Perfect lost to Brutus Beefcake. Then he won the tournament to win the vacant Intercontinental title on April 23rd. Warrior had to vacate. Obviously, what we never mentioned that Warrior went into the Ultimate Challenge against Hulk Hogan as the Intercontinental Champion. Hogan was the heavyweight champion. When Warrior won the heavyweight title, Warrior had to vacate the Intercontinental title. And Mr. Perfect, he won it in an 8-man tournament on April 23rd. This was right after he'd lost to Brutus Beefcake at WrestleMania 6. Now, you're the conspiracy man, Alex. Why did Mr. Perfect lose to Brutus Beefcake, Hulk Hogan's best pal, at WrestleMania 6 if he was then going to win the Intercontinental title and become Warrior's challenger at the house shows?
I have absolutely no idea, but now is the time for me to, in the interest of fairness, I was the biggest Brutus Beefcake fan as a child ever, and I was absolutely elated that he beat Mr. Perfect. So when people talk to me, I've always liked, like, I was a bigger WCW fan in the end than I was a WWF fan, and that's one of the reasons I've always liked British wrestling, once I understood how undervalued it is. So I'm always the guy that doesn't like, I'm not saying I prefer Pepsi to Coke, but as an analogy, I always like the second fiddle player. I always like that unloved one. So to me, like, everyone was like, oh, who's your favourite, Hogan or Warrior? And I'd be like, Brutus Beefcake, like the entrance and the, like, I don't know why. In hindsight now, I look at it and I'm like, wow, the Honky Tonk Man would have maybe been a better pick. but I balance it out by my favourite tag team being the Rockers, and I always thought they were awesome. So I don't know why they did it, but I'm pretty sure Hogan played a part in it somewhere.
I'm sure he did. I mean, it made no sense. Mr. Perfect was winning the Intercontinental title, and then he was going to be one of Hogan's challengers one of Warrior's challengers on the house shows. I mean, this was, Warrior needed a strong opponent. Also on the show, another interesting match, Andre the Giant and Haku, who were known as the Colossal Connection, They lost the WWF Tag Team title to Demolition. That was Andre's last televised match for the WWF. So that was, and he also did he sort of did it was actually a bit rubbish, really. He did like a babyface turn, split from Heenan. But that was Andre's farewell as a TV performer for WWF. So it's not something that people really talk about. So, that was like 3 years on from the huge WrestleMania 3. But yeah, it was definitely Andre's time to bow out.
And thank God there was those tiny little miniature Pope mobiles to take Andre all the way back and to the ring, because that was a long walk.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. But yeah, there's just like loads of matches, most of which were short. Dusty Rhodes and Sapphire beat Randy Savage and Sensational Sherry. That was quite a come down, really, for Randy Savage from the previous WrestleMania, when you think about it. Losing in a tag team match after headlining the previous year. Also, it was the famous Roddy Piper and Bad News Brown match was on this show. They went to a double count out. That was the match in which Piper painted himself half black. Do you remember that?
I do, and it's become a very like a big bone of contention ever since, hasn't it?
Yeah, I know. Bad News Brown, I don't think he appreciated that at all, and I totally understand why. So yeah, never understood that feud. Didn't understand why Piper did that. So yeah, I think that was probably about that was it. I mean, everything else on the show. I mean, there was the Orient Express versus the Rockers, your guys.
Yes.
Yeah, there was that. So yeah, once again, 14 matches. WWF managed to get pretty much everyone that mattered on the show. So at least everyone got a good payoff.
Now, we are rapidly running out of time to keep this within the hour. But I think we can afford 5 minutes to sort of lead into what we're going to be discussing on the next podcast, which is what would have happened at this time if it hadn't have been for an incident that took place at the Clash of the Champions in Corpus Christi, Texas. Because around about the same time that the Ultimate Warrior was winning the WWF title, his former tag team partner in the Blade Runners, Team USA, Steve Borden, Sting, should have also been winning the WCW title. But unfortunately, due to something that happened at the ill-fated Clash of Champions event, that didn't take place because Sting ruptured his patella tendon, and it was really a spanner in the main event title scene works of WCW at the time. Tell us a little bit about what happened there.
Yeah, it happened, as you said, Clash 10, February 6, 1990. Didn't actually look that bad, when Sting suffered the injury. He was like climbing up a cage and then he was attacked by the Horsemen because Sting had actually been like a friend of the Horsemen. We'll get into this more in the next episode of Wrestling Histories. We'll talk more about the Iron Man tournament at Starrcade 89, which set all this up. So yeah, Sting suffered the patella tendon, the ruptured patella tendon, and that threw plans into disarray. Lex Luger had to be turned babyface for the next pay-per-view, which was Wrestle War 1990 Wild Thing, which was February 25th, 1990. So Lex Luger ended up facing Ric Flair in the main event of that show. They actually had a hell of a match. Do you remember that match, Alex?
I do remember it. In fact, it was one of the first WCW VHS releases that came out in the UK.
That's right.
I remember being very excited when I saw in WH Smith there was it was, let me see if I remember this, Starrcade 1990, Halloween Havoc 91, the Capital Combat and Wild Thing, I think, were the first ones. And Wild Thing, it was interesting to me because I was a massive Sting fan, but I also saw the value in that match with Luger and Flair. And I think Flair, many people see the 80s as being his prime, and we would just come into I think he still had it in 1990. I still think he was a really, really good main event heel. So it delivered as a contest.
Definitely did do. I mean, Ric Flair, I don't know whether that was Ric Flair's last excellent, outstanding performance. I mean, it could have been. I'm not sure if it was. Maybe he had other ones that were equally as good, but I just really felt like that was still the real Ric Flair in the ring there, the guy that absolutely had it. And he proved it that night against Luger. So, yeah, 38 minutes and 8 seconds. Unfortunately, the match ended via count out. So you can't have everything. So yeah, Lex Luger basically stood in for Sting because Sting was on the shelf with the patella injury. One thing that should be mentioned, this is going back to WrestleMania 6 and the Hogan versus Warrior match. Sting, WCW's number one babyface, this is just to let you know that, yes, there was still a war on. So Sting's out with the patella injury. In the Hogan Warrior match, Hogan he basically tumbles to the floor, and and then he's selling a knee injury at ringside. He's hobbling around and he's in massive amounts of pain, and then moments later, Hogan has made a miraculous recovery from this injury to his knee. Gorilla Monsoon observes he might have just temporarily dislocated the patella there.
Wow.
So yeah, that was what Monsoon said in the main event of WrestleMania 6. It was an obvious, transparent dig at WCW's top babyface Sting, who'd had to have surgery on his patella. But Hogan, well, he suffered a patella injury and he just, shoved it back in. It was like Rambo in First Blood. Everything's just fine. Or shoving the ribs back in, he can just continue. It doesn't matter. He didn't need surgery or anything like that. So yeah, that was something that was very notable at the time because Sting was out and it was, huge thing because it totally disrupted WCW's plans. And then at WWF's next big show, they include a spot in the match to mock Sting. So yeah, there was definitely still a war on then, Alex. Definitely still animosity.
For sure. And Lex Luger, it wasn't just at Wrestle War that he would get his match against Flair. That would continue at Capital Combat 1990, this time in a steel cage. But I didn't think the steel cage match between Flair and Luger at Capital Combat was as good as the match that they had at Wrestle War, but it wasn't that big epic cage that Wrestle War will forever be remembered for, but instead a much smaller cage at ringside, which contained somebody who will forever go down as one of the worst cameos in the history of professional wrestling. And I guess before we wrap things up, we have to mention the one and only RoboCop's appearance in WCW. Tell us the story about why RoboCop ended up being there at ringside.
Yeah, incredibly, Capital Combat 1990 held May 19th that year in Washington, D.C. It was actually subtitled Return of RoboCop. RoboCop was actually the star of the show. So yeah, what had happened was TBS bigwigs, they'd entered into an agreement with the producers of RoboCop 2, which was released in June of 1990 in the States. From what I understand, I've read this many times, been told this by lots of different people, so I'm figuring it has to be true. WCW's bookers were strongly opposed to any sort of movie tie-in or anything like that, but they were powerless. The deal had already been done with TBS execs. RoboCop was appearing on that show whether they liked it or not. So yeah, basically the Horseman had locked Sting in a small cage. Remember that, Alex?
I do, with rubber bars.
That's right. And then RoboCop comes along and breaks open the cage bar, bends the bars, which are obviously not real. We've seen this in enough movies over the years where they can sort of make obviously fake metal bars look sort of real, but somehow, even though the RoboCop people, the RoboCop producers were involved in this angle, they couldn't make this look real. It's almost as if WCW deliberately sabotaged the angle in order to stick it to the TBS execs and the producers of RoboCop by making the angle look so naff.
And to put this into perspective, this isn't too not elderly, but elder gentlemen now looking back with the benefit of hindsight and saying this was bad. I can tell you that when I first saw this at 11 or 12 years of age, I was in awe at how appalling it was. So it really isn't, it just hasn't stood the test of time. I seem to remember, and I might have remembered this wrong, it looked like the door was already open and loose before RoboCop apparently ripped it off his hinges. And there's Sting, who is now going to become this company, once he's healed, top credible babyface, cheering RoboCop. And I remember finding the whole thing a curious farce, but it didn't stop me becoming a WCW fan in time for what was going to be a very important, I guess, changing of the guard, a passing of the torch, because Sting would recover, not just from his patella tendon injury, but from this atrocious angle to take on Ric Flair at the Great American Bash, and Ric Flair against Sting for the belt, as well as the return of Hulk Hogan and Ultimate Warrior, and how he's run with the WWF title actually went down in terms of both creative process and, I guess, box office draw, pay-per-view buy rates, is all going to be covered in Chapter 8 of Wrestling Histories. Do remember, leave us a comment underneath this video, like us on social media, you can tweet, hashtag @FinnMartin, you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, all of the usual places. Please subscribe to us on the WrestleTalk TV podcast network, and of course, subscribe to us on the WrestleTalk TV YouTube channel as well. Finn, it's been great having you for this chapter of Wrestling History.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, thanks once again. And really looking forward to WCW, the Great American Bash 1990, which was subtitled New Revolution. Yeah, looking forward to talking about that, SummerSlam 1990, and so much more in the next episode.
And remember, you can hear that episode in just 2 weeks' time on the WrestleTalk TV podcast network and YouTube channel. But in 7 days' time, you'll be able to hear from myself and Finn again with the Finn Martin Report, where we talk about the more current and modern world of professional wrestling. Until then, for Finn Martin, I've been Alex Shane. This has been Wrestling Histories. Thank you for joining us.